grade, or people who can say that that report probably changed the trajectory of their lives. So when I was in 9th grade, I was given a project to research my genealogy and prepare, I guess, a presentation and a report based off that person. So I chose to do my grandfather. His name is Otto August. And I delved into the history. I actually had a photo album with pictures from the early 1920s all the way through the late 1940s that my grandmother had pieced together. And I delved into that history. I read documents that were written by Nazi officials. I had a really intense experience early in my adolescence that, you know, brought me to that, you know, new height of understanding about, you know, what the world is capable of in probably one of the most negative ways. And there are few people on earth who will say something more terrible has ever happened than the Holocaust itself. You're talking about a period of time that killed 6 million Jews and 11 million people worldwide. I guess I'll begin by kind of setting the stage. Does anyone know what year? Well, let me do it this way. So yesterday was January 30th. 84 years ago yesterday, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Now, it started earlier than that, of course. He grew up on the kind of border between Austria and Germany, and he was known for being very mediocre, not a particularly good student. At 18 years old, he had moved to the heart of Austria and tried to enter into art school and got rejected. After his mother passed away shortly thereafter, he became basically homeless. He was going, you know, to soup kitchens, living in poor houses, and reading basically a lot of anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish literature that was circulating in the area around that time, and he devoured it all. He loved the idea of, you know, blaming others for, you know, his own situation and latched onto it. You know, this isn't because of me, but I'm a victim. He started attending, you know, little groups that were very focused on the ideal person, you know, the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the Aryan ideal. And those groups, when they got together, discussed, you know, that these are the great people, but then there's this subset, there's this other species, you know, like the Jews, like the Slavs, like the Poles, that, you know, are an insult to the superior race, that try and degrade it and are rats in the society. So while he was living on the streets, other things were happening in the world, and World War I began, and he got off the streets by joining the army. So a couple of years later, the war ends, and Hitler feels cheated. He feels like Germany should never have submitted defeat, and that they were robbed of their glory. So he starts bringing together these groups of ex-military men, and he brings these groups together to discuss this defeat and to lay blame on those people who they feel are inferior in society. So Hitler is a founding member of the German Workers' Party. This is around 1920, so he's around 30 years old. And he founds this group with just 7 other members. And he starts to discover for the very first time that he has a knack for oration, that he can kind of hypnotize people with his speeches. More and more people start coming to these meetings, and he's able to almost brainwash this group of people into accepting his ideology. this superior Aryan race. In 1923, he actually tries to overthrow the government. Most people don't realize that that happened, and he failed and went to jail for a couple years. He was charged with high treason. The coup did not go as planned. Shots were fired, and he was arrested. So once I don't know if you've heard of the book Mein Kampf. That was Hitler's book that he wrote in prison. When it was published, most people thought him an unimportant maniac. They called him a crackpot. In fact, he was the butt of a lot of jokes in the country. I mean, people thought it was just ridiculous that this person would ever be in power. But lo and behold, he kept at it. He kept on holding meetings. Those meetings grew to rallies. And by 1929, anybody know what happens? The stock market crashes and a worldwide depression takes over the world. Hitler used this in order to really take hold over the unemployed and the unhappy people that were living in Germany and around Europe at that time. So by the early 1930s, he had renamed his party to the Nazi Party and started, I think, with about 108,000 people in that first election where he ran for chancellor. But it wasn't until yesterday, 84 years ago in 1933, that he was actually named chancellor of Germany. Within a month, he had become a dictator. I don't know if anyone knows how he actually accomplished that, but basically the communists burned down the Parliament building, which is our equivalent to our White House. Of course, evidence showed up after the war showing that, in fact, it was the Nazis who burned down the Parliament building. So when the Parliament building burned down, Hitler made the case that he needed to be the all-commanding power, not for himself, of course, but for the safety and protection of the people of Germany. So President Hindenburg signed off on that, and he became the Führer, the leader of Germany, the dictator. It gave him the power, and it gave his soldiers the power to do anything and everything they wanted to without any repercussions. Whether that's listening in on phone calls, taking mail, to arresting people, for whatever reason. He continued to hold these gigantic rallies, and the country became kind of Nazified. Swastikas everywhere. If you've seen old videos of those rallies where they're all going "Hail Hitler," Mein Kampf, the book he wrote in jail, that was once considered the work of an unimportant maniac, was a required textbook in schools. And this ideology based out of hate became the center core of what was taught and accepted in mainstream society. And how does that happen in a democracy? How does that happen? These are the questions that we ask ourselves today. And yes, there was an unrelenting push of that. It was taking over the media. It was propaganda. It was mob mentality more than anything else. These are the things that really took over at that point, where if you weren't a part of it, you felt that you were inadequate yourself, or you were scared for your own life and the safety of your family. And that society was built around fear and injustice. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were introduced. This was a set of laws specifically designed to strip Jews of their rights and civil liberties, and also enact laws that forced them to separate themselves from society. Children weren't allowed to go to school. You weren't allowed to hold certain offices and jobs. You had to wear a Jewish star on your clothing in order to be easily identified. People would refuse you service. You're basically no longer treated as people. You're no longer a citizen of Germany. and such. So that's where I think I'm going to begin the story of my grandfather. So here we are in the mid-1930s. My grandfather, Otto, was born in 1919. So he was a teenager by the time these things were all happening, the youngest of three. His father was a traveling salesman, and his mother was a stay-at-home mom in Frankfurt, Germany, the capital of Germany. It's where he grew up in an apartment there. Gonna kind of start passing around some pictures. So in the pictures I have him, that's his bar mitzvah in one of the corners there, and playing at the beach and just happy childhood, you know, that kind of thing. So early in the war, his older brother Herbert got a letter from the Nazi government saying that he needed to report to one of their, I guess, police stations in order to register as a Jew. Instead of doing that, he decided to flee the country. And it was a very smart decision on his part. He actually ended up going to Portugal, and his side of the family is still there today. So he went to Portugal to flee probably, I want to say 1936 is when he left, maybe 1937. And his parents shortly followed. Now, Elsie, which was my grandfather's sister, and Otto decided to stay for their education. They didn't see that it was a good idea to leave the country to where they would be in a place where they didn't even speak the language, starting from scratch and trying to rebuild a life when they were so focused on educating themselves there in Germany. And in fact, my grandfather did complete his high school education and his business school education while still in Germany. And he had just gone to a farming school in Grossbriesen, Germany, when something pretty horrible happened. And that was on November 7th, 1938. That's a date that still makes Jews all over the world shudder to this day. Does anyone know? Kristallnacht? Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht literally means night of glass, but really it was the night of broken glass. That evening, it started with a rally of about 30,000 Nazis, actually in Nuremberg, Germany. And those Nazis, every single Nazi in attendance was given a hatchet and permission to do whatever they liked to the Jewish people, especially destroy property, humiliate, torture, rape, murder, whatever they so pleased. And that's exactly what happened. On that day, almost every single synagogue in the country was destroyed. Torah scrolls were burned and ripped, and people were hurt and humiliated. There are countless recollections of people's memories on that day that are truly just awful to read. On that day, about 30,000 Jews were arrested and put into concentration camp, including my grandfather. So Otto was at the school. It was a farming school, like I stated, for Jewish boys. He and 20 of the other students at the school were arrested and brought to Buchenwald concentration camp. Buchenwald was one of the first, I think it was the second concentration camp, and one of the largest concentration camps in the country of Germany. Now, at that time, he was there, I believe, if memory serves, about 11 months. What he witnessed there, he never spoke of in detail. He only spoke in general terms of murder, torture, experiments, and just said, in general, that everything you've heard is true. How he got out, we're not 100% sure. All we know is that he had friends inside and outside of the German government that were able to get not just him, but all 20 of the other students from that farming school out of the concentration camp about those 11 months later, and were able to bring him to Holland, where he was basically sold as a slave into a farming community there. And I know that you wouldn't think that slavery in the middle of the 1940s was a thing, but here we are. So he was there in Holland for about 2 years, and by the way, there's a picture. Oops, I forgot about my pictures here. So this is the farming school in Germany. Here. This is the entrance to Buchenwald, and that's a picture of him upon his release after about 11 months in the camp. He weighed about 80 pounds upon his release. And in general, in concentration camps, if you ate anything at all, it was probably about the equivalent to 250 calories a day. And while you were there, you were expected to do back-breaking labor, you know, digging trenches, ammunitions, you know, things to support the war effort to basically kill your own people. So he was released in 1939, sent on a boat over to Holland, and he and his 20 comrades were there for about 2 years. Then they were included in another secret trade to the U.S. And this was, you know, certainly going to be one of the luckiest things that ever happened to him, and he could not have been more grateful in his life for that moment. It was actually a quota sponsored by the Thalheimer department store in Hyde, Virginia, and they brought these Jewish boys, these Jewish refugees to America. What's that? Thalheimer, or Thalheimer, I don't know how to pronounce it. So it wasn't until he returned to that farm as an adult with his children that he actually realized that it was kind of a slave trade situation, that they were actually making a great deal of money by bringing these Jews over to the U.S. and putting them to work. But he spent the majority of his life believing that this was, you know, someone who was just an incredible person who was going to, you know, reach out across seas and help, you know, these young boys and save their lives. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, but at the time, and in truth, it did save his life. And these are the farmlands in Hyde, Virginia. So he actually ended up getting out of the farming situation in Virginia by joining the U.S. Army. Before he was even a citizen, he was still a German citizen, but at the time they needed every warm body. So he joined up in 1941, and he ended up going to, what was that called? The last cavalry unit, the horse, you know, the horses and all that. It was the last one. They were almost about to take that off the table completely from the Army, but he actually went and trained in Kansas at Fort Dix, and trained on horses and all of that. So after basic training, he got a leave in order to go visit his family. Now, his sister Elsie had traveled to the U.S. When he was already incarcerated in a concentration camp, and she had been living in New Jersey with an aunt and uncle. So it had been about 7 years since he had seen her or his parents or his brother. His brother was still in Portugal. His father died while in Portugal, and he never saw him again. But his mother had made it to the U.S., so his mother and sister were living in New Jersey, and he, after receiving his basic training, were able to go and visit them for the first time in those 7 years. And that's a picture of that visit. So shortly after that, he returned to a military base and going about their everyday duties as officers. And one day, I believe the date was December 7th, 1941, he found himself in a movie theater when all of a sudden the lights went out, the film stopped, the lights turned on, and the staff of the movie theater came up front and said that all officers needed to report back to their base immediately. Does anyone know what happened? Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor happened and everyone moved out. The U.S. was now officially joining the war effort. And my grandfather was anxious to get back to Germany in order to fight the Nazis. Lo and behold, that's not what fate had in store. Instead, he was actually sent to Puerto Rico. And in fact, that's where the article that's placed on your tables took place, was in Puerto Rico. He was there for 2 years, actually. And while it upset him that he wasn't going back to Europe immediately, he did feel that he needed to do his duty to America, and whatever they felt he needed to do during the war effort is what he was going to do. So he went to Puerto Rico, and he had mostly clerical positions for a long time. One of his positions was actually opening up official mail documents and getting things done and getting that to the people who needed to read them. So one day he's there opening up mail, and he comes across a letter suspecting him of being a German spy. So that was enraging, to say the least. I mean, he was absolutely shocked and floored, and he took the letter immediately to his superior officers and, went on in his thick German accent about how ridiculous that was and how, as a Jew and as a person who persecuted by the Nazis, he wanted nothing more, to go back and fight, these bastards, really. He wanted to do that, and if that was the whole reason that he's in Puerto Rico and why he's a clerk and not fighting overseas where he should be, then he wanted to talk to someone about it. And he did resolve that situation and very quickly moved up the ladder to a corporal sergeant, and was sent by his own request to join the military intelligence training school in Maryland. So he completed that military intelligence training, and finally in 1944 was sent back overseas with his military intelligence team. And he was very excited to do that. So these are some photos of him in Puerto Rico. In 1941, he did become an American citizen while he was stationed in Puerto Rico. Actually, 1945, he finally returns to Europe. They've already been deployed to liberate the concentration camps, and he wasn't immediately sent back to Germany. He first went to London, and then did go back to Brussels. But the war was now over, technically. While the camps were still being liberated. I think the last camp was liberated in April of 1945, and he did not get back to Germany until July of that year. So the war was definitely over by the time he finally got back, but it doesn't mean that the job was done. As you know, shortly after the war, the Nuremberg trials took place, which was the first international world court. I think first and only international world court. Maybe Saddam Hussein may have had one. But it was basically a trial in Nuremberg to prosecute 21 Nazi war criminals. My grandfather was able to be a field interrogator while he was in Europe and actually interrogated one of the men who was tried in that trial and later hung as a result of his crimes. So I imagine that was more than gratifying. So this is a picture here of his intelligence team, where he was there with them in Germany. And while he was stationed in Germany, he got to do a couple of things that most Jews who have been persecuted by the Nazis do not ever get a chance to do, even those who survived. He was able to visit his childhood home, which was basically a pile of rubble. He visited his high school, which there's a picture of, where it's completely bombed out on the inside. And I'll pass those around. So he was able to do these things, but there's one story that's kind of a little bit odd to tell, but it's kind of a beloved memory of my family, which is while he was stationed in Frankfurt in Germany. He left the military base one day without so much of a goodbye to, everyone else. He was still in his full military uniform, equipped with his U.S. issued rifle, and he actually went to his apartment that he had grown up in before, not the one that was bombed out, but one later in his life, right before he had been taken. So he went there and he knocked on the door and a family answered. There was a family living in that apartment, and he pointed his U.S. rifle at them and started screaming at them in fluent German, dressed in a U.S. Military uniform. And he was screaming at them in fluent German to get out of his apartment, and he ended up sleeping there that night and went back to the base the next day as if nothing had happened. And I guess we just always imagined that he needed to take something back that was taken from him, and that's what that experience did for him. So shortly thereafter, he was honorably discharged from the Army. When the war ended, most people were. He met his wife in late 1941 at a USO. My grandmother, Marilyn, she was serving as a hostess at one of those USO for soldiers. And they met and got married within the year. My father came along in 1952 and his younger brother in 1955. And they raised a family in New Jersey near his sister, and just went about their life. I always like this last picture, which is of my grandfather and my father, his son, as a little kid, because it's actually very similar to a picture on the beach of Germany of his own father with him as a child. And I just love that he had that opportunity to have that experience that was so close to being taken away from him forever. And while my grandfather did survive, I have quite a number of family members in my extended family who did not survive. In fact, 48 members of my family perished in the Holocaust. But he was lucky, he did get away. He died in 1988. Within 2 weeks of his wife, my grandmother. They were both very sick and in the same hospital at the time. He was always significantly sicker than my grandmother, and the doctors expected him to go first, but he actually died 2 weeks after her. And the doctors said the only reason that he's still here is because he didn't want his wife to suffer through the pain of his death. And his willpower, which we all believe he got from the war, kept him alive then and kept him alive all the way through the very end. I think that's kind of it. Yeah.
Oh.
The end. Any questions?
I gotta take a deep breath. Took a lot of notes. So, did your grandfather always stay in New Jersey after he settled? And
They did. So they stayed in Germany pretty much the whole time up until they were too sick, and they were, in hospice.
Did they ever take the opportunity to go back to Germany after sort of a different point in their life? Or?
Not after the war, no. The only trip they did take was back to the farm in Virginia, where they did uncover, that it wasn't as heroic as they originally thought.
Right.
But other than that, no. And my grandfather really never spoke too much about the war. The only reason I know as much as I do is because of my grandmother's effort to make sure those memories were preserved.
Thank you.
And he did give one interview in his life regarding that time, and it was 2 months prior to his death. And I do have that recording. But he did give an interview basically on his deathbed of his time during the war. And a lot of what I pieced together was from that interview. But never went into detail about what he saw in the camps.
So it's like that, is that, that recording, that interview, is that like cataloged like at the Holocaust Museum and archived there, or is it archived any place?
You know, I don't
Do they
know.
do that?
I know that it was a journalist who wanted to do the article, but I don't know what he did with it on his end. I never saw the results of it. I don't know if we know. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you.